retiring in 1978. For another 36 years, she was a loyal volunteer developing the library's historical archives. And after I wrote that, I'm like, you all know that already, for the Keeping Society. We're very pleased to co-sponsor this program with the Guilford Keeping Society, and I'm going to turn it over now to Bob Hartman, President of the Keeping Society, who will introduce our speaker. Bob?
Good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening. I'm going to move this a little so I can see Stephen better on the camera. Thank you very much. Welcome one and all. I'm going to be brief because I want Stephen to have the full 60 minutes because we've been warned. I want to start by saying the Guilford Keeping Society mission, what is it? It's to collect and preserve and share the history of Guilford for present and future generations. You probably know we not only have two historic, astounding houses that tell stories of the Guilford's character and culture at pivotal times in our history, we also have these remarkable outbuildings, such as the Paddock Barn and the Corn Crib at the Dadstone Tavern, the Privy, Corn Cribs, the Blacksmith Shop, and the Woodworking Barn at the Thomas Griswold House, and the latter two probably qualify as museums in their own right. As for the Griswold House Barn, which will be christened with a formal name soon, we invite you all to a barn painting on May the 20th, when volunteers from Guilford Rotary and the Guilford Keeping Society will be applying Benjamin Moore's Best Red, donated through Page Hardware. So please, when you see Andrew, when you go to Page, say thank you, please. Now, through the generosity of the Dudley and the Griswold families, GKS is honored and privileged to become the new stewards of one of the more formative, small, but mighty structures in Guilford. This acquisition will further underline our commitment to education. Where's Pat Lovelace? Raise your hand. He's our prime educator, to portray accurately who we once were in the new world and to provide a foundation on which everyone in Guilford can stand, whether new to town or born here. I believe that we are who we were, and the more we know, the better. This evening is a perfect example of our mission. Mimi Dudley's husband, Stephen, will tell us the story of the Clapboard Hill Schoolhouse. I won't take any more time. I give you Stephen Dudley. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, for I believe those are kind words, but I'm not sure. So what we have is a picture of Edel. And for those of us who were in the Clapboard Hill neighborhood, as I was from 1957 and a neighbor until she passed, she was not only a character, a quiet presence, a treasure, a resource for information when you didn't know anything, or she pointed you in the right direction, and generally a very nice person to have and be part of the neighborhood. So I'm honored to be here this evening on behalf of the Edith Nettleton Lecture Series. So what you have is the start, and we'll move to the next one. That's the building as of December this past year when we donated it to the Keeping Society. Now I'm going to start off by admitting, having lived on Clapboard Hill for 65 years, I don't know where the time went, but that's another whole issue in and of itself. I thought I knew the history of this building. Boy, was I wrong. Woo! For a number of years, the family lore was that it was moved twice till it got here and built elsewhere. And that was what everybody believed. Well, that wasn't quite the case. Once the discussion about the transfer started, then Tracy Tomaselli, Tracy, I hope you're in the back there somewhere, thank you, provided her research, which are the next two slides, and we all were wrong. So in 1835, a committee was appointed by the first school society of the town of Guilford to locate a schoolhouse in the Clapboard Hill district. And as you can see, that committee was Samuel Robinson, Samuel Spencer, and Amos Fowler. And they were appointed in 1835. In November 1835, they came back with a recommendation, and I'll try and read it. Unanimously of the opinion that the schoolhouse be set upon land of Mr. Amos Bartlett, a few rods west of the house of Mr. John Griswold, the said boundaries having been driven 2 stakes, one for the southeast and the other for the southwest corner of said house. As we understand, the district has liberty of Mr. Bartlett to set the house on his land. The committee have not assessed any damages. What does that mean? So we then go on from there. It appears that, based on the available records, that the school was actually built in 1836 and put in service, but it appears to have been constructed within the highway limits, not on the land of Bartlett. The width of Clapboard Hill Road is very wide at this point in time, about 70 feet between what would have been the 2 stone walls. And just as a comment on that, as doing a professional surveyor and doing a lot of work in this town, that's a very, very, very wide road. Most of them were 40, 50 feet, somewhere around in there between the stone walls. 70s are just an unusually wide road. So, why was that the case? Amos Bartlett died in July of 1836 without a will, so it is assumed that the school was built within the highway limits, as the district did not have control of the land. Placing the schoolhouse within the highway was a common practice in town at that point in time. Also, it appears that the entire Bartlett property was bounded by a stone wall on Clapboard Hill Road. Most of it's disappeared today, and construction of the school would have required the broaching of that wall. One of Mark Dudley's predecessors had a letter that was found in the house, and it's from Amos Bartlett's grandson, Richard, and he corresponded with the district saying that upon further consideration, we concluded to sell you the 1/4 of an acre, the lines to run as we arranged, provided the district agree to support the fence. The we noted in the letter are Anna Bartlett, widow, George Bartlett, and Ruth Bartlett. A committee was appointed to purchase the land and make repairs. A deed was executed on October 14th, 1851, but not recorded until June of 1852. And things take a lot of time, but I don't know why it took that long. Even for government working then, that was a long time to go along with it. The land was purchased for $35. And, but the deed, strange as it was, ironically listed Bartlett on the 3 sides and Clapboard Hill Road on the 4th, which was incorrect because the land on the north side was Griswold, the Griswold household that went along with it. But that's the way it listed all the way through, and that's the way it came to be. So we don't know why it took so long to do that. And we then come up with the next piece of it. And after the purchase of the land, it was in October of 1852, it was voted to appoint a committee to use the remaining funds in the treasury and what could be collected on the list to move the schoolhouse. And the committee was appointed. Things moved a little bit faster at this point in time because Horace Dudley, who lived where Mark Dudley lives now, built the house across the street, kept a diary in which he documented work and assisted in the moving of the first few days of November. And per those diary entries, November 1, dug cellar hole. November 3, worked in the forenoon. November 4, helped cut timber to draw the schoolhouse. November 6, helped moving the schoolhouse. November 8th, John, whoever John was, helped me stack a cask of lime, helped underpin the schoolhouse for the rest of the day, and November 20th he delivered a load of wood. Now for those of you who have some sort of idea, that meant that the schoolhouse, and I was out measuring today, was moved back a minimum of 60 feet, probably closer to 65 or 70, to put it where it is now. The question is then asked, was it someplace else in the roadway and was moved? Because if you look at the site as it is now, it's way to the left, far away from the outhouse as possible. That may have been part of it. But it's not centered on the lot at all. So these questions, there's only about 8 feet on the south side and only about 8 feet on the west side. So it's tucked in the corner of the lot. Whether that was for more of a schoolyard or not, nobody knows. That's lost to history. Joel has provided us a copy of this 1838 topographic map. And this map shows on it where the structures were listed at that point in time. The red arrow is the schoolhouse. The green arrow is the Griswold household at 174 Clapboard Hill Road. The blue arrow is the Dudley house at 167 Clapboard Hill Road. And the orange house is the Bartlett house. For those of you who've got a little memory, that was the Sachem Country House, now the house that sits in front of the medical center that's down there. The interesting part about this is that it shows roads that didn't show on the 1852 map, but obviously were there. Clapboard Hill Road being the one that goes up between the 3 arrows. The branch to the north is what was always called the North Road, Tanner Marsh Road. The one under the blue arrow is the South Road, Tanner Marsh Road on the southern half, and Clapboard Hill Road going down to meet Goose Lane. But that is not the location where Clapboard Hill Road meets Goose Lane now, because when the turnpike was built in the 50s, Clapboard Hill Road from Lorry Lane south was relocated further north to join Goose Lane because it went right across where the turnpike is now. It intersected Goose Lane before, somewhere about where the eastbound entrance of the turnpike is on Goose Lane. The other thing that's of interest is that when I was a kid, the area between the Post Road and Boston Street, where Soundview Road Extension is now, that was a dirt path. Wasn't used much at all. The main road that came out of town and went up towards Clapboard Hill Road cut across that corner and created a triangle there. And in the 60s, when there was too many accidents, I believe, at Route 1 and Goose Lane, Clapboard Hill Road, or that extension, the town rebuilt the road so it was opposite Soundview, and then the other one was sat vacant for a long time and then was ultimately abandoned to go along with it. And again, the swamp that you see down there is the upper end of the swamp that comes up from beside the cemetery, from between Soundview and Alderbrook Cemetery in there, and everything just went around the swamp at that point in time. It's important to note that the only facilities associated with the schoolhouse were a wood stove and a 4-hole outhouse. One side for boys, one side for girls. There was never a well. And the students either brought water or it was obtained from the adjacent Griswold or Dudley residences. Even though it was still in service until 1931, there was never power, never phone, nothing else brought into it. Teachers and students, I gotta digress a little bit here. It talks about all the records in the GKS collection. And that GKS collection only exists because of the foresight of previous members of Guilford Keeping Society in the 70s. There was a great renovation that occurred in the town hall in the 70s, 73, 74 range. And at that point in time, the whole second floor that's up those few stairs where the selectman's office and finance office are now, or where finance is, selectman used to be, was a second floor created in the original auditorium of the town hall. The first floor was renovated, and the basement, more importantly, was renovated, and communications was moved in there for a while. But the result of that renovation is the coal bin that was in the basement of the town hall was to be cleaned out and renovated and made part of offices. However, the coal bin had every document that nobody knew what to do with forever and amen. And there were, as it's been described, thousands of documents there, folded up pieces of paper, dusty, dirty, cruddy, and they were going to all go to the dump. But the Guilford Keeping Society caught wind of it, and they managed to keep it and get it accomplished. Now, from my own personal standpoint, David Dudley and my grandfather, Shelton Dudley, there's a little blurb for his obituary back there, were ones who started that, and then it went on to the library committee and from there. But I can remember working across the street at 42 Boston Street in '73, and I had a new car at that point in time, so I parked it in my grandparents' driveway so nothing would happen to it, and walked across the street to 42 Boston Street. And of course, on the way by, I had to go through my grandparents' house because my grandmother always had chocolate chip cookies, and it was always worth getting a few of those along the way. But I can remember my grandfather sitting there with the piles of dusty documents, and he went through them and created a preliminary inventory. He never went much more than that because he liked working at home and not anywhere else. And that was the start of the accumulation of these records. The library committee, Debbie Palouse, Joel, and others, John, have been working still on a lot of those, and they've created some 70 boxes, more than 70 boxes, of documents and orientation and the ability to see what happened. And most of these records that we have now come from the stuff that was going to be thrown out. So there were teachers and students. The records indicate that there were a lot of them at times. And most of these were teachers that had completed a level of school that would be the equivalent of the Clapboard Hill School, but not much else. And so they taught either one session, spring or fall, winter. And over the years, there were some Clapboard Hill natives who taught, including Horace Dudley, who built the house at 167 Clapboard Hill Road, Minnie Griswold, my two-great aunt, Paul W. Dudley, Judy's grandfather, and Harriet Griswold Williams, my grandfather's sister. Horace Dudley was paid in 1848 $56 for 15 weeks, $3.75 per week. Minnie Griswold, in her last year of teaching in 1897, was paid $6.25 a week, princely sums. In the 1920s, Mae Barnes Gilson was hired, and she had just graduated from the normal school in New Haven. And Ethel Candy Norton, Phil Norton's wife, also taught there. By then, there were different teachers in charge of different grades, and the teachers often boarded with neighboring families if they did not live in the area. Many of those teachers were unmarried women who quit when they were married. Aunt Minnie and Harriet were good examples. Minnie taught from 1893 to 1897 and was married in the fall of 1897. Aunt Harriet, after she's married, had her hands full helping Uncle Lester at Maple Shade Farm, just the next building up Clapboard Hill Road from there. In interviews with Joel, former students described a teacher, Miss Kate Dudley, who lived in the Edith Nettleton house before the Nettletons did, with her sisters just prior to the Nettletons, as a good teacher, but filled with old-fashioned ideas. You find that in the interviews of the oral history of Guilford. Mae Gilson, who they later, after Clapboard Hill School, went down to spend a lot of years at Church Street School, boarded with the Dudleys, and she also boarded with the Nettletons, and went, as she learned here, for the first couple of weeks that she was a teacher, according to her oral history, she was homesick. So she went back to her family house in Brantford, but that required her to go on the trolley to New Haven and then come back on the bus to Brantford because there was no direct connection at that point in time. And her father finally told her after a week or two, you got to grow up and you got to do this and you can't be coming home every night. Uncle Paul Dudley was the owner of Hillcrest Farm. He had a dairy. He had what was the nicest house on the top of Clapboard Hill. It isn't anymore. His grandson Martin owns it. And I'm sure Uncle Paul continues to spin in his grave at the fact, but when Uncle Paul owned it, everything was neat. He had birdhouses, and everything was the way it needed to be in his mind, and he was very, very meticulous about making sure that it was there. But he was a kind soul, and he worked hard, and he was part of the spirit of what made Clapboard Hill what it was and how everybody pulled with everybody else. And my last memory of Uncle Paul is living just down across the street a little bit from where he did. He had a Renault, a light blue Renault. And he'd load up the front of that, because it was a rear engine car, open the hood, load it full of pumpkins, and then take it around the neighborhood and give them to everybody so everybody'd have a pumpkin in the fall to put on there. You could hardly see over the steering wheel with the front up like that, but he did it. Other records list the school enumerations. There were a number of schools, numbered schoolrooms, and it appeared that never students attended all at one time. The district drew students from a wide area, and that expanded and contracted depending upon where other schools were at that point in time. From as far as Goose Lane, as far as the East River, over to Norton Town and Podunk. Certain students were paid a stipend for building the fire in the stove, raising the flag, or stacking firewood. And just to give you an idea, in the 1889, the district paid 25 cents per week to make fire in the school. And that was how it was described in the minutes, to make fire in the school. And a cord of wood was delivered to the school for $7. Howlett's Bridge over the East River, or Clapboard Hill Road over there. This is a photo that's from the Shelton Dudley collection at the Guilford Keeping Society. It's been colorized by John Plant to give it a better idea, and it's a very nice photo of what's going on. This is a photo that was taken by Redfield West in 1895. And this is where I also give another plug for my grandfather. My grandfather, Shelton Dudley, lived at 45 Boston Street, was born in the house next door at 39 Boston Street, where the Beamans currently live. And he was a curious individual. He was in electronics. He did car repair, did auto electronics in car repair back when they were starters and simple things like that as opposed to the current electronics. He went to work for Eklund in 1940 and was head of their test department, so that any design that Eklund Ignition manufactured at their plant over on Brantford Hill was one that he'd extensively tested in order to make sure that it would work and last. But his passion was photography around town. He resolved in the 50s to take and try and accumulate all the collections of glass plate negatives that he could accumulate from the photographers that did work in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And he searched them out all over everywhere. I can remember going up to a house in Westlake with him, down in a very damp basement, hauling out boxes of glass plates, the cardboard barely holding together, and they were loaded into the back of his VW Bug. And he didn't drive very much, he didn't like it, but if it was something like that, he'd be willing to go for it. And then he came home, cleaned them up. He had a dark room in his basement. He printed them and then stored them and kept them and preserved them. And he had them until he died. And my grandmother, and after my father died, my grandmother decided that it was time to get rid of them, and they were given to the Keeping Society. And at that point in time, over 4,000 negatives of both his in print negatives and in glass plates were given to the Keeping Society. So there's a very large collection which is solely due to his efforts to accumulate all of those over the years. So that's where they had to go in order to get there. And some notable students whose names you might recognize. Again, Paul Dudley at Hillcrest Farm. Raymond A. Dudley, a missionary in India from 1919 to 1949 and various times after that. Harriet Griswold Williams, who co-owned Mapleshade Farm, which started on the top of Clapboard Hill, and then the dairy was moved down in the 40s onto the cutoff on Route 1, which was where Village Walk is now. And Anybody of a certain age would remember going down there and getting an ice cream cone, which most times was more than you could eat. They were never stingy with the size that went along with that. H. Philip Dudley, former editor of the Shoreline Times and writer, was a Yale graduate, organist at the Congregational Church for 55 years. Phil described himself as a moderately talented organist. There were those who said he sometimes played with his elbows, but it went along. He was a very good person. Edith Nettleton, of course, for this series, is the librarian here for many decades. Ruby Murray Orchid, and one of the 4 daughters of William Henry Harrison Murray, Adirondack Murray, who wrote a number of novels, was a minister, and an early outdoorsman in the 1860s, lived up on Nortontown Road. She became the wife of John Orchid, and John Orchid was one of the 2 people who competed in the 30s as to how much land they could buy in the Clapboard Hill area and Podunk area. Orchid versus Goss. The Gosses were the result of money from the brass in Waterbury, and they spent a lot of time trying to accumulate land, which they did a lot of, and kept a lot of people from losing land during the Depression because they bought it because they had the money. Vernon F. Dudley, Judy's father, farmer, woodcrafter, and he worked for Munger Lumber after the farm closed in the 60s. Edward Elliott Griswold, my great-grandfather, he was a successful Clapboard Hill farmer. There's more to come on that in a little bit. Elizabeth Nettleton Thies, Edith's younger sister, who was a teacher. My grandfather, John Griswold, who was a farmer. He raised turkeys, he did clock repair, he worked for the Guilford Finishing Company, he worked for Bishop's, he worked a lot of different places. Marge Williams Moraski, who owned and operated the Yankee Knitter, for those of you who were knitting in town for a number of years. In my feebleness, I left off Emma Dudley McSweet, who was another very large member of the Clapboard Hill community and about town quite a bit. And it's clear from the success of these and many other students that the instruction at the Clapboard Hill School prepared them well. Phil Dudley, in his oral history book, talks about how you went to school because you needed to learn, and it was impressed upon you that you were there not to play around, not to do anything, but to learn, and that was your job as a student to learn there. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be as popular these days as it was back then. Next picture shows the schoolhouse in 1895. Now you'll note the open pasture. You'll note the fence, which the district was required to maintain. And you'll note the tree in the foreyard. Doesn't show much else. Oh yes, you'll also note the road where it is now. If you go by there today, the road's roughly in the same location, but it's about 3 feet higher. And the reason for that is, between my grandfather's and Mark's house, it was like this. And that was deadly as all hell in the 50s and before. And once people started using that as a little bit of a speedway, it was not safe to go over that crest of the hill. So in 1958, the road was going to pieces. Buttonball Hill, as it was called, from my grandfather's down, had always been known as being a muddy and unstable mess even after they paved it. So in 1958, the town came in and they used what was called the soil cement process. They came in, ground everything up, mixed cement in it, put a little water on it and reshaped it, and it became hard as nails, and then they paved on top of it. But part of doing that was raising the road in front of the schoolhouse up to my grandfather's house and taking the curse out of the top of that. Of course, one of the first things that happened is Dr. Henry Finn, who lived up on Orchid Drive, was coming home one night. I think he'd had a little bit too much to drink, but he lost control of his Triumph convertible and sort of went off and hit the phone pole that was right at the corner there. Just sort of went off the edge, and that was the end of that.
Stephen, are all those trees aren't still there behind the schoolhouse, are they?
That's back in what would be the back of the 138. I don't know what is still there at this point in time. It's kind of hard to see because everything has grown up so much.
Yeah.
Another picture from 1900. Again, this is obviously in winter because the snow's there. People are out in front, but gives you a good view of the outhouse. And you'll notice there are two doors there, one on the left and one on the right. The one on the left partially open, and I'll get to that in a minute that goes along with it. The next picture is what I find one of the more interesting ones, because what it shows is a pile of wood against the north side of the schoolhouse, a sled out in front that somebody used, sleigh tracks in the front to go along with where somebody had obviously brought somebody to school or something to go along with that, and the pile of stones and the fence. Across the street from my house, down the hill a little bit, before they built houses, there was stone wall right in through there. There's stone wall, and you'll see in the next picture up above it, and it appears that there was stone wall that went all across the schoolhouse piece, which was moved out of the way when the schoolhouse was moved and when it became the schoolyard. Here's the next picture. This is the only one that I've been able to find with flag flying. And the flagpole was on the north end of it. You can see the fence around it, not very well maintained, even though the district was supposed to maintain it. But you see the pile of stones to the left there, the stone wall going down the hill, and the stone wall that still exists between my grandfather's house and the schoolhouse property. Now, it's my conjecture that the stone wall went right across from one end of that to the other, and it was moved when the schoolhouse was moved and when there was a schoolyard that created at that point in time. My guess is that this is in the late teens or the early 20s because there are utility poles there. Those utility poles look like they most likely are just telephone lines and not power lines, which is not unusual because the house, the Griswold house, was one of the first two houses on Clapboard Hill that had a telephone. My great-grandfather wanted one and he got one. I don't know why. So I'm guessing that was what it was that went along with it. But you'll notice the tree is a little bit bigger than it was in the previous picture that went along with that. Now we get to some pictures of some of the grubbier students from there. This shows, it's listed on the Keeping Society collection as 1895, and it supposedly includes my grandfather's older brother Floyd. That doesn't work. Uncle Floyd was born according to family genealogy in 1892. That would have made him 3 in 1895, so it's most likely not there. And if I was to pick out Uncle Floyd, he's the third from the left. So I'm guessing this is probably closer to 1897, 98, somewhere around in there. But you'll notice the cleat on the house behind it. It shows that that's the rope that went up to the flagpole for the flag. The shutters are closed. Don't know why, but they were. And if you look really carefully to the right-hand side, there's a bicycle tucked behind the schoolhouse. So somebody rode their bike to school that day. Another picture of students, and this one has the names that go along with it, and that was thanks to Joel for having correspondents who had this. And you notice that they're Howarth, Barrett, Dudley, Parmalee. Let's see, for Edmund Dudley was the ultimate person who joined Leon Beckwith later on in the 20th century to form Dudley and Beckwith Stationers. So that's the start of that. Raymond Dudley is the same Raymond Dudley who ultimately became a missionary and went off to India. So they managed to make something of themselves, even though they started in the Clapboard Hill School. The next one, oh, let me go back then. The teacher's Minnie Griswold, my two greats on. And so that puts that somewheres in that vicinity from 1893 to 1897 when she quit. So that gives you some idea. The next picture appears to have most of the same people in, but it looks like they've grown, so maybe it's another year or so. I don't know. And then we get to this one, the famous photo that's everybody's seen. And that is Phil, Edith, and Elizabeth in 1918. And the same three people some 70 years later. So, you know, it's Phil and Edith were both born in 1908. Elizabeth was born in 1911, so they were 10 and 7. And that makes them 80 and 77 in the picture that you have there. And the schoolhouse is still looking a little worse for wear, but it's still there. After the school closed, it was sold to Martha Keller from New York City for $350. Nobody can quite figure out why, but less than 2 years later, she sold it to my grandfather, John Leet Griswold. His mother was Abby Leet, so that gives us direct lineage from the Leets through that side of the family. John Griswold is direct lineage of Thomas Griswold, the Thomas Griswold house. So there's some respectability that we claim there for the family. He was, they didn't say what the deed was that he paid for it, but the tax stamps looked like it was about the same. So I'm guessing he paid around $350 for it also. No record exists as to why he purchased it. The people who would know the answer to that, unfortunately, I was not smart enough to ask those questions before they passed, but that's left to lost history. My Uncle David, who lives in Maine, I talked to him about it, and he says, oh, he says, I think it may have been because Dad wanted to have some property in his own name because the house still belonged to his father. Maybe. He says also because it was adjacent. Maybe. And there have been some statements about how if they had a family fight, he'd move his family there with my mother and uncle, but I don't know the answer to that. That may not have been anything to do with it. My mother was 8 when it was purchased, and some of her written recollections say it was always filled with junk. When family estates were settled, what no one wanted, Grandpa bought the rest, and we had a time going through things. My grandmother Griswold died in 1967, and my grandfather lived alone for the next 21 years, though he spent a lot of time with his good friend, lady friend, Edna Shork, who lived nearby at 24 Lorry Lane. And that was good. The family was very happy about that also. Primarily used as storage, the building sat otherwise unoccupied for a number of years. In 1944, a hurricane took down a Griswold barn on Tanner Marsh Road, opposite Mark's driveway. And the last wooden wagon the family owned, previously used for salt haying on the meadows, was disassembled and all the parts placed in the cloakroom of the schoolhouse. God forbid you didn't save something at that point in time. As the other buildings on the Griswold property decayed, various items were moved to the more weather-tight schoolhouse for presentation. In the 1950s, for a few years, the building served as a workshop for Alexander Luddington, Glenna Griswold's father. He painted the structure red, and it remained that color until it was repainted white between 67 and 69. For most of this time, there was no maintained lawn, just property hayed twice a year, and Judy's father was the lucky candidate to be collecting what little hay would be grown off of that, but you didn't waste any gas mowing it with a lawnmower for anything. And there it is in red and white. Very, very strange. And you can see the hay. This is in January, I think it is. But it also shows that the sparse growth of hay in front of it, because there are a lot of rocks that underlay that particular piece, which leads me to believe that may be why the schoolhouse is set back so far on that piece of land, is there may be some rock underneath there that nobody wanted to deal with. Moving on to 1969, my grandfather, much as he hated painting, finally painted it, so it was no longer red. Paintbrushes and he had a great aversion to each other. And you'll note the one remaining fence post out there between a couple of rocks. If you look at it out there today in the field, that's roughly where the stone wall would have been at that point in time, and the ones that we thought before the school was built. And it's, when the property was surveyed adjacent at 138 Clapboard Hill Road, a stake was put there, and that was viewed as the corner of the property between the two of them. So it's a pretty good indication of where that property limits of the road were at that point in time. I'll call your attention to that hole right there. It's a hole that's existed in the foundation for as long as anybody can remember. Whether there was ever a stone in there that fell out or not, we don't know. The neighborhood story, however, is that Edith's next younger brother, Louis, when he was attending the Clapboard Hill School, if he got a paper he didn't like, he didn't bring it home. He stuffed it in the hole there and then didn't have to worry about it when he got home. So that worked. And here's the outhouse. My grandfather had limited resources, and the outhouse was never a priority. You can see in the back there afterwards, if you want, there's a picture of his corn crib in 1977 with my lady I was dating then, a certain Mimi Griffin, and me there. He didn't want it to fall down, so he put a chain around the beams to try and hold it together. Never put the roof back on it, but he put a chain around it so it wouldn't fall over. So that was where a lot of the tomato crates that you'll see in a minute were stored. He died in 1988, and it became left to the two children, my mother and my Uncle David. Now I have to start out by saying my mother hated having her picture taken. Period, the end. And this is the one of the few that exist with just her in it. She had some with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren that she smiled in, but not individual ones. This is the only one that I could find that didn't have a large grimace on her face at that point in time. After my grandfather's death, David and his wife had the house built at 169 Clapboard Hill Road, next to my mother's. And the 11 acres that surrounded my parents' house that my grandfather had was divided up so that each of the kids had part of it. During this time, David repainted the schoolhouse again. He didn't have quite the aversion to a paintbrush that my grandfather had. And David and Cynthia moved back to Maine. However, the hay wagon that I talked about previously, around 1990 or so, David took the hay wagon, because he worked with people at Mid-State Tractor and the volunteers in the museum at Durham Fair, and he decided it was time that it went somewhere. So the wagon was hauled out, reassembled some 47 years later, and taken up to Durham Fair, where it is on display every year. You can see there's some plywood in the bottom of the picture there, but it's a bowed bottom in it. And that bowed bottom helped the hay stay where it should be as it was forked up on there. And the ladder on the front helped be an indication of how high you could be before you lost your load as you were towing it home. But it's just one of those things that you couldn't get rid of. You had to have a better idea as to what to do with it. So, we're getting towards the end. The practice of John Grizzle of benign neglect on the school continued with the children. In 2003, the roof was in such poor condition that the grant was obtained from the Guilford Preservation Alliance for the installation of a new shingle roof. David and Mother both had limited resources. I had kids in college at that point, so I didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. We got through it. So money was tight, and we're glad we got the grant, because I don't know how many more times I could have climbed up on the roof to put a tarp on it and nailed it down. So that gets us to last year. David moved to Maine, and after my mother passed, her half of it went to my sister's 2 kids after my sister had died a few years earlier. And they didn't want any part of it, so they gave me their interest, and so I ended up with half of it, and David ended up with half of it. After the pandemic, it was clear that David's kids, 2 in Maine, 1 in Virginia, my kids, 1 in Farmington, 2 in Massachusetts, though Ann asked her 5-year-old if she wanted to mow the lawn down there, and she said no, she didn't want to do that. So we moved on from there. But we decided to be in a position where we donated it to Keeping Society. We'd had a long discussion previously about, well, what are you going to do with the schoolhouse? And when I came on the board, that was one of the first questions I was asked, and I said, well, I got to get my uncle on the same page as I am. But they finally agreed, and my middle cousin, Roger, was probably one of the happiest of the 3 of them, because I think he's David's potential executor, and he didn't want the hassle of having property in Connecticut and property in Maine that he'd have to deal with. The board of the GKS agreed to accept it, and that's where we went. Oh, I'm sorry, that's your president there accepting the key from me just for recording it for posterity. This is the inside of the schoolhouse. And the property and the structure and all the features are now in the possession of the Guilford Keeping Society.
Yay.
So, the interior, and again, this is a case of benign neglect. Nothing has been done to the inside of that building since it stopped being a school in 1931.
Cool.
So you have, the most unusual feature is the curved ceiling. We don't know why it was a curved ceiling when the building was built in 1836, but it appears that that was original. You'll notice the round circle where the clock was on the wall, but that was where the teacher could see it. It was behind all the students. The students faced this way, so that wasn't anything that they could take a look at. You'll notice that there are school desks there. The original desks have long been gone. The one in the foreground is one that my mother had, and you'll note on it 3 tin lunch pails that they would have used at that point in time. Whether she got those out of some family piece or whatever, my mother collected things, and that's what went around there. There are 2 other desks in the background, which have been donated recently from the Lombard family, because they were associated with a school desk building company. And the butter churn, which came from the farm. If you look down in the lower right, you can see my uncle's wagon from when he was a kid. And we'll go to the next slide that goes along with it. This one shows the corner over there, tomato crates, and what you see there is a bathtub. It was a iron oilcloth bathtub, and it looked like it was originally designed to stretch between 2 chairs filled with water, and then you'd bathe in it. I don't know how that worked, but it's listed on, down on the side there, which is just behind the thing, there's a red tag that says 1872. This bathtub was not on the Griswold property. It was in the back attic of my grandparents' house at 45 Boston Street, and we just decided we didn't want to leave it there. I've only seen one other like this, and it was an actual one that was shown out in a display at the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn. So I assume there aren't many of them left. Who would have saved anything like that anyway?
Well, they saved the poor holer there as well.
Yeah, well, that's the next slide. Cool it.
I gotta go.
The original board for the 4-holer we rescued from the decaying schoolhouse just because we thought it'd be interesting. It didn't survive too well in the cloakroom, one corner of it, but the rest of it's still there, and that's what would have been there for anybody to use from the start of that building through till it stopped in 1931. Oops, one too many. Now you'll notice there that all the original blinds are still in there. The chalkboards are the cheap way of doing chalkboards. It's plaster with black paint on it. Mae Jilson, in her oral history, writes, they weren't easy to write on. And when it got really bad, they'd repaint them again, but it didn't make them much better to write on. So, you have a corn sheller that came from the Griswold house up the street in there. Pieces of old kerosene things, and a plow, which we'll see in just a minute. The stove, it's at the center of the room. The teacher's desk would have been over in the left corner over there. You can see that it's an oblong stove, and if you take a look right over there, you can see the original flagpole is sitting against the wall over there. There's an ox yoke over in there that was left over from the Griswold farm, and a few other pieces that go along with it. There was some question early on as to whether that stove was the original or not. And in doing my research, as Edel would like you to say, you do your research and you find out what you know and you don't know. Mae Jilson described it as an oblong stove made out of tin, and she burned her coat on it one morning when it was warming up because she was trying to get close and get warm very much. So it's the stove that's been there. It's listed as 1879, made in Norwich. And let's see, move on. These are the only writing desks that are left over from the original school, the only writing surfaces. There are just the 3 of them, and there was some discussion about when the desks were burned, but that's allegedly what happened. David claims that he never remembers. My mother's no longer here to ask. And the family lore was that they were burned by Alexander when he had a workshop there, but David said no, they were gone before then. I remember a pile of metal ends beside the outhouse. David says, I don't remember that. So, you know, whatever it was, but they were not there and they haven't been there for years. There are, however, the hole marks on the floor that shows where they were screwed down all the way through there. There's one end piece that's up in the attic, the little attic area over the cloakroom, woodroom, and if I can get a steady enough ladder, I'll get that down, but I haven't found one yet, so we gotta work on that. The floor's not too good there either. Let's see. That's the door for the outhouse, which we rescued. The interesting thing about it is it's got not only the regular latch, but it's got a lock on the inside of it. Now, I'm really surprised about that. I would have expected that that would not have had a lock, because I would assume the teacher would want to get in and drag somebody out of there if they'd been in there too long. But that had a lock on it. So what that tells me is that was probably the ladies' side, and the lock was put on so the teacher wouldn't be disturbed. That's my guess. This is a picture of the cloakroom, woodroom, whatever you want to call it. Notice the very large vertical wood siding, sheathing that's in there. That's all there is. The clapboards are nailed to the outside of that. The floor in there is in the very state of very bad repair. The wagon sat in there for 40 some odd years. The plow, which you'll see in the next slide, sat in there for a lot of years. My cousin's motorcycle sat in there for 20 years. It wasn't, so the floor didn't last very well. You can see the post and beam construction looking up into the attic. That post and beam would have obviously been secure enough so that when the building was moved in 1852, back that 70 feet or so, then you'd be in a position where there was enough frame there that they could just roll it back and go from there. Syracuse plow that was used on the Griswold farm next door. It was pulled by oxen. They never used horses for anything other than buggies and riding. They had oxen all the time. There are pictures somewhere in the 24 tubs of Guilford history that came out of my mother's house that are in Ann's basement at the moment. She's been very kind to let them do there until I can deal with them. But they used oxen. And you have the tomato crates. Now, tomato crates are an unusual thing that you see, but they were a great part of Guilford agriculture from the 1890s, 1880s, through to the maybe 1930s, somewhere around in there. Everybody grew tomatoes. And as you can see, tomatoes were a cash crop. And if you look to the left, that is behind the Sachem Head Canning Company, which was on Water Street. That is basically in the town parking lot. That's basically the town parking lot where it exists today. And as you can see, there are 5 high as far as the eye can see for tomato crates. So you gotta think that was a whole heck of a lot of tomatoes that went out of here. The picture on the right is Charles Davis, and that picture is roughly where Rolfe Gardens is now. And before the cutoff was built, there were lots of acres that were cultivated north of that went all the way up to almost where Pinchbeck's Christmas tree farm is now. So that went all the way through there, and they grew tomatoes quite a bit. This picture of the Sachem's Head Canning Company. It's unknown what the date is, but he started selling coal in 1905, so we assume I picked a number of circa 1908.
Yeah.
And that's the brick building that's where Dudley and Beckwith ended up being the barber shop and whatever else is in there at the moment. The Norton Block, I believe it was called at that point in time. And this is one of the original labels for Sachem's Head brand. Not particularly viewed as politically correct today, but that was what they did, packed for the Standard Beef Company. Knowles Lombard also took tomatoes, and they canned them under the Puritan brand at their canning factory down off of Driveway that was ultimately demolished and where Public Works is.
We got the Puritans.
So, the future of the Clapboard Hill Schoolhouse. Keeping Society is formulating a long-term plan, and we'll be seeking grants and donations once that's finalized and adopted. For now, the Griswold and Dudley families are pleased that it is owned by an entity that will preserve this last untouched schoolhouse in Guilford for the enjoyment of future Guilford and area residents. And I want to thank everybody who helped me pull together information around on this. I hesitate to name everybody because I'm sure I will leave somebody out, but you all know who you are, and I appreciate that very much. So we got a time for questions. Barbara.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I have a question and a comment. So the schoolhouse was moved in 1852.
Right,
When was it built?
1836.
Oh, okay. And the second thing is, I know that the Keeping Society moved an outhouse with oxen. So I guess my question is, when is the schoolhouse going to be moved by oxen down to the Griswold property?
Thank you, Barbara. I once again appreciate your putting me on the spot, as you always do. There's a lot of discussion as to what happens with the schoolhouse. It takes a lot of money to do whatever needs to be done.
Send money.
So, but the question is, what do we do? It's 18 by 24 by 15 feet high. Even if you put that on a low boy, it's too high to be able to move anywhere. There are, at last count, 40 some odd wire crossings that would have to occur. When I was a kid and they moved houses out Boston Street, the utilities dropped the wires and put them back up and didn't charge anybody anything. Right now, it'd cost you 6 arms and 4 legs to have the utility companies do that. And it's too large, too tall to be able to get under them. If you were to take the roof off it, for example, you'd then be in a position where you'd be destroying those vertical slabs on the peak ends. The other problem is that it's been described potentially as the bugs holding hands, holding it together in some locations. So the benign neglect has put us in a position where we don't know what the structural integrity is. Another option would be to take it apart and reconstruct it down at the Griswold house as another option. Third option is leave it where it is and repair it and use it occasionally. The problem with the third piece is that it's an orphan piece, it's out of ways, it's not necessarily someplace close by. You know, in my foolishness, I volunteered to continue to mow the lawn for the next 4 or 5 years as long as I'm able, but one of these days it's going to have to be somebody else and it goes along with it. So we're talking about where it goes from here. So that's sort of where it is. Pat?
As part of the answer to that, there is a group called Preservation Connecticut. It's a nonprofit. They have what are called circuit riders who come and evaluate buildings, and I have contacted them, and hopefully they will come. And they also will give us ideas of grants we could get to update the building. We would love to have it be part of our Early Guilford Day program that we are doing for the 30th year this year. So once it's all fixed up, I hope it will be part of that, wherever it is. If it is moved from its present position, I'm not sure it can be on the National Register of Historic Places. I think it has to be in its original position.
It's only original
That's the
ones.
way they do it.
Yeah. But
I will
again,
check into that.
the question becomes money, money,
Oh,
money,
yeah,
and
money's
money.
a big thing.
So that's where we're at the moment. Any other questions? Mark?
Good evening, I'm Mark Dudley. I personally wanted to thank Stephen for a really wonderful, detailed job pulling all the facts together. And just two things that I know that weren't included, and they're just personal facts that my family has told me over the years. One is that, attesting to the quality of education in a rural schoolhouse, also Raymond A. Dudley attended Yale University.
Yep.
And went on to be a missionary. And one other interesting fact, my father told me more than once about jumping on his sled in the morning and sliding down the hill from the house that we live in now to build a fire. So, anyway, thanks.
Yeah, if anybody's really interested, all of Raymond A. Dudley's letters and writings are in the Yale Divinity School Library, so you could go in and do that also. Debbie?
I'm surprised that there were any male teachers. I thought all teachers were females, and my understanding, because my grandmother had this happen, she didn't quit because she got married just because she wanted to. It was required. If you were married, you couldn't be a teacher.
I didn't know that for a fact, so I wasn't going to state it, but it appeared that that was the case.
And then my mother's generation, then you couldn't teach after you became pregnant.
Yep.
So,
Joel?
Well, Stephen, that was a first-class documentary. I've been calling it a documentary, and it's going to be recorded and hopefully replayed. But it's been said before, and it needs to be said again, and again, and again, and again. What you did with your uncle, David Griswold, is the ultimate act of preservation and the ultimate act of benevolence. And I believe, and I'm sure others will agree with me, that generations unborn will be thanking you for your gift. And I think it deserves another round of applause.
Yeah!
As I've said, Joel, thank you very much. It was the time. Pat?
I just want to say that the glass plate negatives and all of the other negatives that we have are now housed in the Edith Nettleton Archives Room at the Mead at Stone Tavern. So our library committee takes care of all of them, but they've also had pictures printed. John Plant has updated many of the pictures to really make them easier to see. But I just thought it was kind of ironic that they ended up in the Edith Nettleton Archives Room.
Both Edith and my grandfather would have been very pleased with that outcome. Very, very pleased. Yes?
Hi, can I just ask a question, because I don't know, and I'm new to Guilford, although I came because my grandmother went to that school. So I'm wondering, you said the pictures are at the Keeping Society. Is there a public place that you can see
Yeah,
them?
the library. Joel, do you want to explain it? That they're at the library?
Well, the
in
library
historic room?
committee has scanned them under the able direction of John Plant, who introduced us to 21st century technology and digital scanning. There is a Guilford Keeping Society archive site, and I would say the vast majority of what we have is on that site.
It's on the Keeping Society webpage.
Guilford
Keeping
Keeping
Society.
Society Photo Archives. We'd be interested in knowing who your grandmother was.
Her name was Josephine Slavinsky. That was her.
Of
And
course,
she lived
Goose
on
Lane.
Goose Lane, yeah.
Of
There was a
course.
farm there that she and her family lived on.
Neighbors of the Corrados.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, it's interesting, I don't know, Steve, if you heard this story, but the Corrados lived on Goose Lane, and I think Mae Jilson reported this story, and it's also in the Shoreline Times. Tracy Tomaselli could confirm this. But the Corrado family was a large family, and I think during Mae Jilson's tenure as principal or teacher at the school, one or two of the Corrado children ingested mushrooms and died of mushroom poisoning. And that really affected Mae Jilson during her tenure as a teacher as part of this school.
Debbie?
Quite a tragic story.
The prints, it was mentioned that many of the photographs that they scan, the majority of them are in the reference library, in the historical room here in the
Upstairs.
library. That are,
Okay.
on the reference desk, there are 10 albums or thereabouts.
thank you.
Yes, there are many of the pictures are there.
Any other questions? If not, I thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
There's some refreshments in the back.
Thank you. I just want to mention, I'd just like to thank Loretta Lyons for letting us stay a couple of minutes after 8 o'clock, and Winnie Seibert, who's part of the event, our program committee at the Guildford Keeping Society. There are cookies in the back, some beverages, and away you go.